For the past several years, Roxbury has been hailed as Boston's next major frontier for new development, especially around Dudley Square. But even as local residents become more alarmed about gentrification, the square continues to show signs of disinvestment or investment deferred. As Roxbury City Councilor, our guest has been trying to make sure that local residents benefit from any growth in housing supply or commercial activity, including the sale of recreational cannabis. We'd like to welcome the councilor from District 7, Kim Janey. Thank you very much for being with us, Councilor.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with recreational cannabis because we see the people coming in already trying to make money off it, and I guess you're concerned that not enough of that is going to people in the city here.
Yes, and so I've put forth an ordinance that would prioritize local businesses from the communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. So I think it's important that we take a step back and look at the history in this country in terms of who has used cannabis and who has been arrested and incarcerated for the use of cannabis in this country, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and how that has impacted many residents, certainly in the community that I represent. So you're talking about people who have been separated from their families, who have had not the ability to earn income while they were separated from their families, locked up. And it's important that we roll this out in such a way that communities that have been locked up are not locked out of this economic opportunity. It's estimated that this is $1 billion industry. And it's important that we be intentional about ensuring that there is equity as shops open in Boston. And so it's not so much an ordinance around cannabis or promoting cannabis, but really, if we're going to have that here in our city, how do we do it in an equitable way? So I'm really trying to promote equity and make sure that we're being intentional about that.
Well, you do want to give at least a certain amount of time for having these licenses go to people of color, Boston residents, and some other categories. If you do that for the amount of time and hold other things off, will that work? Because there are other people trying to get in here at the same time.
So I think we've got to do all that we can to ensure that we are creating space for those who have been harmed by the war on drugs to get into this space, get into the cannabis industry if they choose to do so. So what my ordinance calls for, it establishes an equity program within the city, sets up some clear criteria about who would qualify. So if you meet 3 out of the 5, you would qualify as an equity applicant. You would have a priority period where you could start your business. After that 2-year priority period is over, there would be a 2-to-1 ratio for equity applicants versus non-equity applicants. It also establishes a registry. I think part of the frustration is that people don't know where things are in the city, who has applied, who's at the community meeting stage, who's developing a host community agreement, which shops are prepared to open. So this would establish a registry where the owners are being disclosed and the investors are being disclosed, so that not just the applicants themselves, but the residents of the city of Boston would have that information. And it also establishes a fund that would then be reinvested back into the communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs to support small business development.
And I guess this is the fund that sort of makes up for some of that difficulty in access to capital, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that we learned, I held a hearing back in December on this very issue, and one of the things that we heard was that it was impossible for the city to offer small business support and technical assistance to people in this industry because the money that the city has comes from the federal government. So this would establish a fund using the 3% tax revenue, as well as any other fees that are associated with this, with doing business in the city in this area, would set aside that money to then reinvest it back into small business development.
Recently, you were at a meeting about difficulties for business people around Dudley Square. You would think that there's a lot of potential growth there. The square ought to be busier than it is with more things. What are you hearing from the business people at least?
Yep, so there was a very important, powerful meeting that took place last Saturday at Black Market. The owners of Black Market, Kai and Chris Grant, convened this meeting. Lots of business owners, lots of other stakeholders, residents, etc., came out. I was very encouraged by the turnout. and by the level of conversation. So it wasn't just a meeting where people are venting about the problems and the many challenges that we have in the area, but really offering real concrete solutions. And so very pleased to be part of that discussion and trying to lead in that area as a city councilor who represents that area, but is also chair of the Small Business Committee on the City Council. There were lots of good ideas, I think, floated that and they've laid out what they're calling a multi-pronged approach where they're going to have several sessions meeting with folks to kind of come up with a long-term plan. But we heard all kinds of things, from the importance of making sure that we're doing all we can around the rents for commercial space. Some people talked about the need to subsidize the space. Others, including myself, talked about the importance of maybe looking at condoizing some of that space so that the actual business owner owns the space that they're in. So we often condoize residential homes, but looking at maybe doing the same thing for commercial space. People talked about the need for density in the area, having a variety of businesses that would attract more people to the area. It's not enough to have a major transportation hub where people are making connections and continuing on their way. And it certainly isn't enough just to have the school department there. I think people put a lot of faith and hope in the school department being the savior for Dudley. And I think what we all know, for people who live in that area and care about that community, is that we don't need outside saviors, but really the answers that we seek are within ourselves. And so I'm happy to have the school department in the area, and those who support businesses, grateful for that. But I think we need to make sure that we're thinking beyond a school department or some other thing. We've got to have a variety of different businesses. We have to make sure that within the city, the process is easier to kind of navigate for people who are either starting up or looking for assistance with their business. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Public safety was an issue that came up over and over again at the meeting. So making sure that we're doing all that we can for business owners and their customers to feel safe. That being said, I think there are many great things to celebrate in the area. So the other thing that was discussed was perception versus reality, and how we talk about our community is important as well, and making sure that we're celebrating things like Black Market, like Haley House, which is temporarily closed, like Dudley Cafe, like Soleil, all the many businesses that are in the area that, one, need our support, and we've got to be intentional about spending our dollars with these businesses.
What about the property owners, that is, of commercial property
Yes.
around the square? Are they part of the problem?
Well, they have to be part of the solution for sure. And this didn't just come up in the meeting at Black Market on Saturday, but in the week before, there was another meeting that I think Dudley Main Street's held. And they certainly have to be at the table. They have to be held accountable. We do have some property owners in the area now who are not keeping up with their property in terms of making sure that it's clean, that it's free of litter and debris or other things that we don't want to see in our neighborhoods. And so we've got to do a better job of making sure that we're engaging them, but also holding them accountable to keeping up their property. This
is being the news, and we're talking with District 7 City Councilor Kim Janey. Councilor, not too long ago, you did set up a meeting in Dudley Square about the higher cost of housing, gentrification, displacement. Quite a crowd. Talk about the concerns at that meeting.
Oh, there were so many. So this is the November City Council hearing that I held right in Roxbury to talk about gentrification, specifically to the Roxbury neighborhood. And we had like 350 people come out. We had the hearing in the community in the evening on purpose so that we could get lots of people to come. We didn't want to compete with people's work schedules. So it was a huge crowd, huge turnout, and we heard, in part, what we know is that the rents are too high, that too many people are feeling the pain, too many people have been displaced and are facing displacement from our community. And so what more do we need to do as a city and as a community to try to combat that? And so one thing that I did coming out of that was partner with my colleague, Lydia Edwards, and putting forth some legislation to address speculation and flipping in our area. We know that this is a huge concern, that it's hard for anyone who's trying to get into the home ownership market to compete with those developers who have the resources, who can kind of come in, just prey on a community, gobble up all of the property, and then turn around and flip it at, you know, high prices. It just locks out ordinary people. And so putting forth, this is a home rule petition, so after it makes its way through the council and goes to the mayor, it has to go to the legislature. But, you know, important to look at that issue, one, as a way to kind of slow down that, to put an end to the speculation and the flipping in our community, but also raising important revenue that could be reinvested for building affordable housing. And that's what that legislation does. So it's 6% on properties over $2 million, and then there's a 25% fee for those that are sold within 2 years, and taking that revenue to then reinvest that in affordable housing.
Finally, one other issue you're working on again this year, the racial gap, not only in acceptance to exam schools, but I guess in the preparation for the exam too.
Yes, and so I filed last year as well as this year, along with Council President Andrea Campbell, a hearing order to examine the admissions policy for our 3 exam schools. We actually had a really good meeting with the 3 school leaders at the exam schools. We just had that meeting yesterday in preparation for this hearing. We know from the advocacy community, we know from the school communities at the exam schools themselves that this is an important issue, that it's worth exploring. So in my time at Mass Advocates for Children, this was something that I cared deeply about, working with people like Lawyers for Civil Rights and the NAACP and others around how we can do more to diversify our exam schools. As we look at the school system as a whole, we know that it's 87% students of color, but the exam schools don't always reflect that same diversity, particularly when we're thinking about Boston Latin School. Our students enter into these exam schools by taking an exam, but also through their GPA, you know, looking at their grades. Just right now it's a 50-50. Is that the right approach? Do we need to weight one more than the other? I don't know. It's worth a conversation. Are there other things that we can do? One of the criticisms that came up recently in a Rappaport report at Harvard was that students are taking the exam and they're being tested on things that they haven't learned yet. And so that's a problem. Is there a better way to do that? Should we be looking at MCAS, for example? So there are lots of proposals that I think people have floated in recent years, and I think it's worth exploring at this hearing, and so I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, always.
City Councilor Kim Janey.